This is CSaP's Science and Policy Podcast from the University of Cambridge, where we're bringing you the latest evidence and expertise to improve public policymaking. So welcome, I'm Rob Doubleday. This is the third episode of CSaP's Science, Policy and Genetics podcast. In the last two episodes, we've looked at genome editing in particular and agriculture, focusing initially particularly on the UK and the current consultation run from DEFRA on the use of genome editing in agriculture. And we explored in a bit more detail some of the history behind crop breeding and some of the issues that motivated public concern around GM crops around the year 2000 and whether some of those concerns are likely to resurface in the context of genome editing, or perhaps not, because perhaps in some ways genome editing is significantly different. And I think in the last episode, there was quite a lot of agreement that these were open questions that we don't have the answers to yet. And so we're in a process of discovery, both in the terms of the science, but also in terms of how that technology will work in society and how people will react to it. So in this third episode, I'm very pleased to welcome Bill Adams at the Geography Department in Cambridge, and Dr Catherine Rhodes, Executive Director of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And Catherine Rhodes has done research over a number of years on the global governance of biotechnologies and biosecurity. And Bill Adams has studied conservation and people at landscape scales and now also down to the scale of genomes. So it's great that you've both been able to join us. I wonder if I could start, Bill, by asking you, and particularly in the context of your book, Strange Natures, Conservation in the Era of Genome Editing, which is, alas, not out for another year, but I've had a sneak look at some of the material in it, and I know it's going to be really a great addition to the debate. Bill, that book, one of the things that book looks at is the question of why should conservationists be interested in technological ability to change the genome of wild, free-moving species. So just to start us off, why should conservationists care?
Well, thanks very much. I mean, it's quite new that they are caring. Conservation science has come quite late, I suppose, to the game of thinking about gene editing. But there are several reasons. The first and the most driving, I think, is there's a series of problems with global biodiversity loss, which are not being adequately addressed by existing methods. And that's really the big thing. And that relates particularly to problems like animal diseases, plant diseases, which are spreading very fast, like, say, white nose syndrome in North American bats, or some of the diseases of trees, like ash dieback we have in this country. There's a big problem with invasive species, particularly on oceanic islands, mice and rats, for example, which are really hard to control, and the methods of control are really difficult. They use poisons, and they're expensive and very difficult to make it work. There's all sorts of problems with environmental change. Climate change, for example, a warming ocean and an acidifying ocean is really problematic for corals. And people are saying, well, maybe we could breed new corals which would respond to that. And lastly, and slightly wildly, there are people who think you could use gene editing in what they call de-extinction, bringing back species that have already gone extinct. So it's an exciting field for conservationists to speculate about. It's slightly more than barroom talk, but most of these proposals are still somewhat speculative.
Where have some of these ideas where have they got closest to application, or have they been applied in any specific instances?
The nearest to getting a license is probably the use of gene editing to produce a disease-resistant North American chestnut. North American chestnut was a staple of particularly eastern forests, more or less completely died out, rather in the way that elms did in Britain from a very similar cause, an introduced fungal disease. They have created a disease-resistant chestnut, which is available now for planting. They've also used conventional GM technologies to produce the same thing. So there are both those kinds of genetic technologies are there. So that's probably got the furthest. There's also quite a bit of work now on techniques such as the control of mosquitoes, using gene drives and other sorts of techniques.
Great. I mean, I want to sort of probe a little further on the use of gene drive to tackle invasive species. And I wonder, Catherine, if you could tell us, what is gene drive? What does that? Can you give us a sort of very simple introduction to the science of gene drive?
Yes, gene drive is a way of pushing or driving a genetic trait, so a characteristic, through a population in a way that's more rapid than doing it through natural processes. So it would be inherited at a rate more like 100% rather than the standard 50%. And that way it could, if you've got a short generation time, for example, in a mosquito, could spread through the population quite quickly. And so the use you might put that to is by sort of diminish a population. So, for example, if you did it to get rid of all the males in a population, the population would crash.
And how, in terms of the laboratory, how far advanced are these techniques? I mean, is it still at the realm of speculation or scientific experimentation, or have there been demonstrations that these techniques kind of work at a population scale?
Yes, so it varies. For what are now called synthetic gene drives that use the more modern technologies and techniques, including CRISPR, those are still at the stage where they haven't moved beyond the laboratory. But there is proof of concept within that space. But there are older techniques. For example, there's a natural bacteria called Wolbachia that can also function as a gene drive, and that's in a more advanced stage.
Thanks, Catherine. So turning to Bill for a moment, before we come back to you, Catherine, about the sort of the regulatory regime around these sort of technologies. But Bill, how have conservationists responded to the prospect that genome editing, CRISPR-Cas9 can expand the range of what's possible in terms of using these gene drives? Are these being welcomed? Are they being ignored? Are they being looked at skeptically? How are conservationists responding?
Well, as you might expect, it's fairly mixed. I think there is a growing scientific literature talking about feasibility of using these techniques, looking at costs, effectiveness, and risk. And I think there isn't yet a wider debate within the conservation movement about it. And that's one of the reasons why Kent Redford and I have written our book, is to try and broaden up that debate to get more people thinking about it. But there are serious proposals. As Catherine mentioned, there's been quite a bit of work talking about using gene drives to control disease vectors, mosquitoes and malaria being the classic example. Well, mosquitoes also carry wildlife diseases, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about the control of avian malaria in Hawaii, for example. The mosquitoes and indeed the malaria parasite are introduced. They've been introduced by people within recent centuries, and they're now a major threat to endemic bird species. And one of the things that is there as a possibility is to actually use the gene drive to actually control the malaria populations. So that's, it's not happening yet, but the technologies are being driven forward in human health, and it would not be difficult to use the same techniques in wildlife disease control. The other big thing is, as I said, invasive species on islands, mice and rats in particular, are a source of a threat to particularly breeding seabirds. And the present methods of control are mostly poison-based, and they are really expensive. They're quite slow. There is the risk of sort of collateral damage. And people are saying, well, it's much simpler to do it this way, much more cost-effective.
So, that's a fascinating example about the mosquitoes in Hawaii that are carrying as it were, an invasive disease. Is that right? So so the native bird population is vulnerable to this malaria in ways because it's introduced. So the extent to which there is a debate about the use of gene drive in that specific instance, how are conservationists sort of stacking up in that debate? Is it being treated as a very pragmatic question about what's the most efficient, effective way of preserving the bird life? Or are there also some more kind of value philosophical questions about whether this sort of human intervention is wise or right at all?
Opinions, of course, vary. Conservationists are not a single thing. They range from sort of very highly trained scientists through to lay people, and in many different contexts. I think what's interesting for conservation is firstly that these technologies are being driven forward quite outside the conservation world, outside the world of conservation science. They're being driven forward in biotech, in agriculture, in human health. And I suspect the debates about the use of these technologies will also be driven forward in those contexts. I actually think it's not clear sort of how people who care about wild nature, shall we say, will respond to those kinds of debates. What's interesting about it is that it feels like an extremely artificial method of protecting something which is valuable because it is not artificial. It challenges the whole notion of nature as something which is separate from the world of humanity, and so which is valuable because it has a life and an existence of its own. And that's, I think, in some ways going to be the acid test for how conservationists in general respond to these technologies. Do they think of it as a wrong thing to do to a wild species which has evolved in its own context? Or do they see it as a clever thing to do to protect that wild species and enable it to go on being in its context? And that's really interesting. And if you look into conservation, there are lots of examples of really very invasive technologies which are pretty much used as routine, like poisoning mice on an island. It's not a particularly natural thing to do, or chainsaws or fire or anything else. So you could say, well, it's just another technology. Or you could say, oh, no, this is a very different technology and it doesn't feel right.
It's very interesting to again, as we did in the last episode, to cast our minds back to what sparked across Europe and in other countries too. But I know a bit more about the European controversies over GM in its use in agriculture 20 years ago. You know, there were lots of different concerns that bubbled up, but some of the concerns which were articulated at the time were around playing God, the idea that technological hubris was taking, you know, humans and their relationship with nature in the wrong direction. So, and that seemed to play, you know, quite a part in how that debate about GM in agriculture played out. So it seems that your case of let's say, you know, avian malaria in Hawaii puts that question very, very starkly. So do you have any sense about how people in Hawaii, not conservationists, you know, or in any other part of the world, think about these kinds of issues?
Well, I wasn't present, but there was a discussion back in 2016 of the possibility of using genetic methods to control mosquitoes that carry avian malaria. And I think the debate that followed that did include a strong argument from the sort of indigenous people of Hawaii that sort of messing in this way was not the right thing to do. So I think, and it's going to be very interesting to see how these kind of technologies are taken by different communities, both different countries, but also different communities within countries. The other thing for conservationists to think about is how they feel about the use of these technologies on what are effectively wild species, but which are being controlled or edited for human purposes. So, I mean, the pests which crop technologists want to protect against are actually wild, and they move around the field. They move around from the field to the field, and the crop varieties that are edited also have wild relatives, and therefore there is, you know, if there is the possibility of sort of genetic material moving out of the field into a relative or other purpose. So if you're interested in conservation of nature, thinking of nature as enveloping human activity, then any use of this in a free living organism is going to carry with it this sort of concern about that flow out, or the risk, if you like, of that kind of movement of genetic material. And I suspect, therefore, for myself, that it will exactly run down the train tracks created by the earlier disputes about GM for the same reasons. People will have this concern about proliferation and risk and escape. And frankly, it doesn't, you know, saying that that's trivial doesn't stop people worrying about it, as we saw last time.
The train tracks, you know, extend further back still. And so I'm interested to bring in Catharine here, because the question about, as Bill says, you know, both the technology travels around the world, and then potentially also its application in free moving creatures can move around the world. So it is one of those instances that does, it seem, call for some sort of international agreement about how to govern, how to regulate, how to control these technologies and their uses. What's the current framework for thinking about the governance of these technologies, Catherine?
It actually cuts across several different sets of governance and frameworks. So, for example, the one that would be most central in what we're talking about is the Convention on Biodiversity, and it has a protocol that's specifically on the movement of living modified organisms, which are just another term really for genetically modified organisms across borders, and the sorts of risk assessment and risk analysis that you would want to take place before that happens, and having informed consent and having processes for reporting if something happens accidentally in this sort of process. But it also would come up, for example, for the organisations looking at animal health and how you deal with vector-borne diseases. The World Health Organization is interested in technologies for those purposes too. It will also come within things like trade agreements as well. And one of my interests, I shouldn't say is a sort of strong concern in this area, but is in preventing the deliberate misuse of some of these technologies. So that would fall under the Biological Weapons Convention as well.
Well, let's come back to that interesting, important question. But thinking at the moment about, the sort of, that's one of the themes we've been looking at is really the huge explosion in the laboratory, metaphorically, of technological possibilities that recent developments in genome editing have afforded. And then, Bill's interesting examples about how they could be applied in conservation, we heard in agriculture. Do you see the current governance frameworks as being kind of sufficient, flexible enough, comprehensive enough to cope with these kinds of new technologies and new applications, or do you think they need to be revised and updated?
So there's certainly some sort of need for adaptation. I don't think there's particularly a need for creating any new treaties, but it is a general problem at an international level as well as other levels that treaties and standards can be very slow to adapt, and keeping track of where the science and technology is going and working out how you need to adapt can take time. For that reason, you often get things like more voluntary guidance coming into play before you've got anything in terms of a very firm rule. But there's also, notably, there are discussions happening around this. So again, in the Convention on Biodiversity, there are discussions happening about gene drives and about synthetic biology, whether those create any problems for the conventions, and then how you deal with them if they do.
So just could you say, because you mentioned it several times, the Convention on Biodiversity, could you just give a very brief introduction to that, important convention, and then just spell out really where the kind of issues, let's say, like gene drive, intersect with that convention?
Yes, so it is from 1992, and it's a very big, what they call a framework convention. So there's a lot of specific topics sort of clustering under it. But yes, to protect biological diversity, that can mean forests, it can mean humans, animals, plants. There's a whole range of what goes into it. It does have a specific article in it that deals with biotechnology, and it looks at it as something that both brings benefits for protection of biodiversity, and something that Bill's been reflecting on, but also something that can pose risks. And so it's balancing that. It also has more specific things in its protocols. So one of those I mentioned was the Katarina Protocol. So that governs the transboundary movement of living modified organisms. So that's the one that's specifically dealing with genetically modified organisms. But it also has a protocol that deals with genetic resources. So there is also the point of states having control over who accesses their genetic resources and how they get used and applied.
So just to help us think this through, obviously maybe islands are one kind of case, but let's imagine countries with the land border, and one country has sort of looked at this in depth, had fantastic deliberative consultations, and decided that in these cases it is going to go for it, and it does want to tackle this invasive malaria and use gene drive to do so. But the wild populations won't respect the national boundaries, and if its neighbour has decided it doesn't want to go down that road, how does the Katarina Protocol, or does the Katarina Protocol help with that kind of problem?
At the moment, that's probably one of the areas in which adaptation is needed, because the protocol is tending to focus, again, being developed 90s, 2000s, focusing around the movement of genetically modified organisms around plants. So it's not really designed to govern insects. What you might look to is other agreements that look to control invasive species and whether they would have an application there instead. But yes, it's an area that adaptation is needed, and where you would need some sort of mechanism as well for, I would say in that case, to dispute settlement. So if two countries have kind of opposing views on what they're going to do, how do you bring them together in a forum that allow them to negotiate on that?
I mean, you already have, I think, sort of quite different approaches to GM in, for example, Europe and North America, or Europe and USA, the EU and the USA, I should say, and very different ways of thinking about defining it and regulating it, and so on. And so it is hard to imagine that an industry which is growing as fast as this one is going to be easily sort of regulated globally in a standard way. And that makes a particular problem, as you say, when species are quite mobile. So particularly wild species, which are not the sort of patented product of a particular sort of biotech corporation, like many crops are, but are, free moving, and in a sense, sort of, if you think of it, are often thought of as, in some sense, the heritage of humankind. But certainly the movement question is a real one, and therefore you have a classic difficulty where you have a technology which can be used in a huge number of different ways by a very wide variety of different kinds of actors and in different kinds of applications, some of whose sort of wider implications are harder to assess. I mean, if you do something to battery chickens, then you know a lot about battery chickens. The genome sequenced. They're mostly kept by definition in enclosed spaces by licensed owners. If you do something to a coral on the Great Barrier Reef, it's a different kind of thing.
Just to sort of test up my understanding of this, Bill, are there any people that would argue that if there's an intentional change to a wild species were made, that would create a new increased biological diversity? Are there any discussions about then any kind of responsibility to conserve what has been artificially created? Does that new creation then become something that people may worry about conserving for the future?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. A lot of people criticize conservation for being quite backward looking. So conservation movement is very good at preserving what was there when the movement started in the late 19th century. So we're not so good at thinking about sort of forward looking and how much you would want to conserve sort of novel forms of life, which are becoming increasingly possible, not just tweaks, but wholly new forms of life. The most interesting and most amusing discussion of this is around de-extincting species, bringing species back from the dead. So, there is active work going on to edit the genome of Asian elephants with a view to making a mammoth, to making an Indian elephant that looks like a mammoth and walks, moves like a mammoth. And there's work on other species like the passenger pigeon. And you think, well, if you did that, what would you have? And obviously, you wouldn't have the mammoth population that existed 10,000 years ago, because you'd only have one individual or a small number of individuals. Furthermore, they'd have an awful lot of elephant genes still in them. So you haven't recreated the species, you've created something new, which is a sort of artificial hybrid between one and the other. And what would you do with it? Would it instantly go on the IUCN red list as an endangered species? And the other interesting question is, could you patent it? If you'd made it, do you own it? In which case, I can imagine that you'd have a sort of Jurassic Park-like potential future with sort of prestigious tourist destinations with sort of recreated species in them, all of which is quite bizarre and a million miles away from the conventions of conservation. And indeed, people have said this. They said this is an extraordinary, weird and extraordinary idea and has nothing to do with today's conservation challenges, which are all to do with much more mundane species. But it brings your point. What is it that this does? Does it create something new, or does it recreate something that is old?
You're posing very, very good questions, Bill. I'm sure there'll be lots of people listening thinking, I wonder what Bill really thinks about, which side does he come down on some of these questions. In the book, do you come down on one side or another of some of these debates, or are you really seeing your role as bringing these issues to the fore to help clarify what questions need to be addressed?
Well, we really try to walk through the the questions in order to frame them in a way that's helpful for conservationists to think about them. And I think my co-author and I probably have different levels of enthusiasm for science or skepticism about science. I'm more skeptical, he's slightly more enthusiastic. On things like de-extinction, I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing to be able to do, but it is genuinely irrelevant to contemporary conservation issues. Some of the other things, I think you throw back on, you move back onto thinking about cost and risk and benefit. I mean, there is an argument that conservation is too concerned with particular charismatic species, with sort of endemic species, with sort of mammals and birds. We're not really addressing the diversity of ecosystems on which the functioning of the planet depends. So, we tend to have an awful lot of elephant charities. We don't have an awful lot of soil bacteria charities. And yet, in many ways, certainly human futures are more dependent on healthy soils than they are on healthy elephant populations, which is not to say that elephants aren't wonderful and conserving them isn't a very good idea, but conservation is a bit mixed up about how it prioritizes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Catherine, again, to turning to you and to sort of stretch the debate in different directions, another thing that people I'm sure will be having in the back of their mind is the kind of the malicious use, the potential for intentional harm being done through these technologies. What's the state of the debate about what genome editing opens up in terms of its potential for malign use?
I think it comes down to thinking about not particular kind of instances of the technology, so not what can CRISPR do in this regard, but to thinking more about the trends. And so the way genetic technologies are developing means that things are becoming cheaper and easier to do. They're becoming more precise and more accurate. They're becoming more widely available. And it's following those trends and what implications they can have in terms of does that facilitate misuse as well? In a lot of cases, it will. But likewise, how do we follow the developments, which mean there might also be better ways of combating misuse? So the things that let us get better about fighting disease, tracking disease, doing disease surveillance, can also help to deter misuse.
But as we know, that sort of surveillance requires investment and coordination at presumably a global level. Are you seeing signs that investment and that coordination is?
I think it's an unfortunate lesson that can be drawn from the COVID situation, is that those systems are not yet robust enough, and certainly need improving sort of what we call sort of further back downstream, perhaps. So thinking of things like, if you get better at surveilling diseases when they're circulating amongst animals, can you work to prevent them jumping across to humans? So yes, there's definitely improvements needed in the global surveillance systems.
One of the things I find most interesting about these sort of debates is that these technologies are increasingly available, and there's an awful lot of discussion that talks about science and scientists as if they were one thing, and technologies as if they were one thing, and applications as if they were one kind of thing. But I genuinely think this is broader than that. There's part of the synthetic biology movement that is really excited about seeing synthetic biology in the same way as the early computer industries, the sort of garage creative environment. And there's a lot of open access material, genetic pieces, which are open access and which can be acquired by groups in high schools and communities. Yeah. And people can start to fiddle with the genomes of actual living things. So when one's talking about regulation, you have to think, well, who's doing this and who is capable of doing it? And actually, will they stop if you ask them nicely or tell them? And those are, let alone different countries, which may have very different attitudes to risk and so on. So it is, when you ask me what I think about in conservation, I think this is coming. I think it's going to become very universal, these kind of techniques. And I think we're going to love some of the applications and really regret others.
Yeah, Catherine, sort of final word to you, because I mean, the points that Bill made, I know are things that you spend a lot of time thinking about. So tell us, where do you think that, collectively, whoever we is here, the world, people in universities, people interested in science and policy should be making, where should we be putting energy to sort of recognize and then respond to the sort of conditions Bill outlined? So
I think one of the things I pick up following what Bill said is I think the greater risks here, and particularly thinking of applications in the conservation area, are less of the person who wants to deliberately use this to cause harm and the person who wants to apply this for good reasons but has not thought through the consequences of doing so. And so I think that's a thing that there needs to be awareness, so that if you are going to be able to have those capacities to sort of tinker around with genome editing in groups that aren't going to have a kind of top-down control from national level, are you aware of what the whole ecosystem context is, how you might assess what the impact could be on the environment, and who you might want to kind of consult about that?
But Catherine, given that, if we are saying that increasingly this could be done in, workshops up, outside, as you say, formal institutional settings, what can be done if we are worried about people perhaps getting excited about the possibility and not spending enough time thinking through consequences? What should be done?
So I think part of that is knowing where you go to ask those questions. So I think this is done quite well. There's an international competition called the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition for undergraduates doing synthetic biology. But they make it quite clear within that you be aware of what the safety, security, and what they call human practices implications, so societal implications are. But if you do think that there's a problem, you know who to go and ask. So who do I flag this with? And I think it's the same, I think this might do something that could cause harm. Who do I ask about it, and who can tell me?
Well, we've run out of time. I certainly have left this with more questions than I started with, and I wish we could carry on for another hour or so, but we can't. So I'll just say many thanks, Catherine and Bill, for joining us this week. And people should rush out and pre-order Bill's book, Strange Natures, and certainly follow Catherine's work at the Centre for Study of Existential Risk for that important, careful thinking through of how these unintended consequences can be anticipated, well, to some extent. Anyway, thank you both very much. CSaP's Science and Policy podcast is a production of the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. The series is hosted by me, Dr. Rob Doubleday, and is produced by Kate McNeil, with the support of research assistant Alice Millington. You can learn more about CSaP's work by visiting us on Twitter @CSciPol, or by visiting our website at www.csap.cam.ac.uk. If you've any feedback about this episode or questions you'd like to address in the future, please email us at inquiries@csap.cam.ac.uk. Thanks for listening.